This presentation today is based upon one of the newest badges that was just opened up as of yesterday, the Assessment as Learning badge. Now I will share right away though that you'll start to notice quite a bit of crossover with some of the new badges. So we actually have several badges that have just appeared in the last 2 days. We have a narrative feedback badge, which is great fun. I'm hoping that a number of people take advantage of it. I'm looking forward to seeing their submissions. We have a competency-based assessment badge that was opened up here in week 3. And we have an assessment as learning badge that opened up this week as well. So you have all of the other badges that you can continue to work on and modules that you can continue to explore. But we've added 3 more for people who are getting done. We've actually had a large number of submissions for badges. I know that I reviewed over 25 on Sunday evening, just from the past few days. So we have a lot of people who are pretty active, and that's wonderful. That's exciting. So these are 3 more options for you. Of course, I know some people are interested in the badges. They're more interested just in the learning, and that's great as well. So what I'd like to do for this presentation, for this live session, is to focus on assessment as learning. So this is a bit of a preview of the assessment as learning badge, but I'll go into some concepts that aren't explicit in that module, or they may be in some of the readings, but I've sort of fleshed them out, pulled them together. I've added some illustrations and examples, and I'm hoping that maybe we can have even a little bit of a conversation as we try this out together. So the next slide, I do apologize, the font changed on me after I uploaded it, so the text is, that phrase, good teachers become less important, should be larger. But I want to get your reaction to that. So if you don't mind for a moment, in the text box, this phrase can have different meanings. And as a result, it can cause us to have different opinions about it. And sometimes it's really just a matter of semantics. But as a discussion starter, I'd like to get your reaction to the statement. To what extent do you agree with the phrase, good teachers become less important? Or in what way might that statement be true? And in what way might that statement be false? So we'll give it a second and give some of you a chance to jot down, type out some of your thoughts. Got it, Aaron and Michelle. I do that often when I type in these chat boxes as well. Oh, let's go with the statement above, Beth. Good teachers become less important. We have a few more people typing comments, so I'll just give it a moment. Yes, Beth, I think that's the point here. It's intentionally an ambiguous statement. It does need clarification, and it's fine to sort of clarify it in your own responses. It's more of a discussion starter, but feel free to continue to type some of your comments. I posed this in a blog post back in April 9th, and then I had a follow-up blog post on April 27th. If you're interested in the way I wrote it, you could just Google ETALE, E-T-A-L-E, that's my blog. I've written 200 or 300 articles over the last year on it. That's where I reflect about my own learning. And if you type good teachers become less important and ETALE, you'll get these 2 articles if you're interested in checking them out. But it's interesting to read the different lists. So Beth wrote, I don't think teachers are less important. I think their roles change. And so that's a great observation. We also have that we don't want students to be the center of the learning. The idea of teacher as facilitator, some might interpret this statement as going that direction. We also have that good teachers become more important because traditional teaching was much more formulated, and now it's more complex. There's more variety and things like that. So all are true, right? It depends upon how we interpret this statement. In fact, it might be clearer if I change the phrase from good teachers become less important to good teachers become, or good learners become less dependent, maybe, right? So that the focus is upon what a really effective teacher does is they equip learners with the ability to learn on their own over time. So we don't necessarily call up our math teachers the rest of our lives every time we have a math problem to solve. Hopefully, they have helped us and guided us along the way so that eventually we have the skills, the knowledge, the confidence, the ability to engage in at least some level of calculation on our own without the need of that teacher. And so in that sense, the teacher over time becomes less important or less necessary for the learner to accomplish the tasks that at the beginning the learner was more dependent on the teacher for, right? So if we even think about the natural development of from infant to adulthood, an infant is dependent upon a caretaker even for feeding them and for caring for them in simple ways, right? Changing their diapers, helping them to get rest, giving them the nutrition that they need. And yet over time, our hope is that when those children develop over time, they eventually they're able to take some of that responsibility themselves. I actually have a couple of young ones, and it was a great joy when they reached the age that they could begin to make their own sandwiches. And they're still just sort of there. But as opposed to my wife and I always engaging in those preparations and helping them out, the fact that they became less dependent upon us. So that was the intention of the statement, is just to get us thinking about it. But it can be interpreted in many different ways. And yes, Erin Michelle's scaffolding certainly fits into this. And the interesting comment also about the meeting where teachers were afraid that blended learning will cost them their jobs. That's a really interesting side conversation as well. I'd love to go into that at some point. In fact, I'm actually teaching an online graduate course on blended learning to a group of about 12 to 15 secondary educators right now. And we've had some great conversations about that very subject. But this is actually one of my most visited blog posts because there was a huge reaction to the statement where some people initially read the statement, didn't read the article, and assumed that I was saying that good teachers who are really good at what they do, we don't really need them much anymore because technology is going to take their place. Now, I wasn't suggesting that at all, and I don't believe that. In fact, I do think that teachers with technology may replace teachers without technology in many contexts, but not that technology will replace teachers altogether. In the same way that we have medical professionals today, even though we have more advanced medical technology, the technology has changed, and the best medical practitioners use the new technology to do their work well. In the same way, we'll probably find that to be true with educators as we move forward. So let's go ahead and dive into this a little bit further. Now, the other thing I'll share, and I think I put this in a couple of the badges, but I really love this distinction. So as we go through this entire course, this Beyond Letter Grades course, really what I'm trying to promote, I guess, my agenda, is that we seek out how we can cultivate a culture of learning rather than just a culture of earning. So if we interview students and we talk to different people, letter grades can take such an elevated role that they begin to take the place of a desire for learning. Instead, the desire is for the grade. We've taken this abstraction, this letter grade, and that becomes the goal, rather than the true initial goal, which is learning. And so my hope is that this assessment as learning presentation and the related module will help us reflect even more about how we might promote a culture of learning, which fits really well with Jennifer's statement about the learning community. The concept of a learning community is exactly what we're talking about here. A learning community is one that's not driven by the desire to earn a particular badge or grade or any kind of external reward. It's largely driven by a group of people that have a shared desire to learn, or they challenge and encourage one another in learning. And so the other analogy that I'll use, and this is, you've probably heard the phrase, give a man a fish and he'll have fish for today, teach a man to fish and he'll have fish for a lifetime. And the pulling from that, what I'm arguing for as we talk about assessment as learning, and I mentioned this in the introductory video for the module as well, is that we want to think about whether we're going to be a fish distribution center, which I took this image where people come and they order their fish and the fish are provided, or if we become a place of fishing lessons. So which of these images best reflect our desire for our learning organization? Do we want to be the people behind the counter who are preparing and distributing the knowledge, or do we want to be the people who are sitting alongside the learners and helping them learn how to fish for themselves, as well as the analogy of teaching them how to prepare the fish, right? Give me a fish while you're teaching me how to catch my own. And that way, I won't starve to death while I'm learning to tie flies. Sure, I like that one. And so that's a good point about scaffolding. So, for example, teaching a person to fish is not saying, go find a fish. That's not adequate direction for some learners. It actually may be for certain learners in a given context, but for many, it requires a little bit more direction. It might require modeling, it might require some more explicit instruction, it requires something like that. But the goal is to work toward a day where we could actually remove the mentor in this picture, and this other person is actually fishing on their own when need be. Or if you take it further, maybe we push this forward 30 years and this the figure's changed. So the young one is now the adult who's passing it on to another person, right? That's really what we're getting at with assessment as learning. But if we want to accomplish this kind of a goal, if we want to bring to reality this type of a vision of our learning communities, of our classrooms and our learning organizations, then I will argue that that will require us to attend to this concept of assessment as learning. Now, assessment as learning is usually contrasted with two other types of assessment. Assessment of learning is most readily described as summative assessment of learning. So that's where we're assessing what's happened. Where's the learning that's taken place? And that's kind of the summative piece, what's happened, and that's kind of the autopsy as I described in one of the badges. Assessment for learning is the assessment that we do along the way that helps the teacher to adjust and to teach students, so to figure out what the students have or haven't learned, and then the teacher can adjust. And that's oftentimes formative of feedback. But assessment for learning can also be when the learner is learning about how they're doing and they are adjusting. But to make that even more explicit, some people actually put that last category in this third piece. So it's assessment as learning. And assessment as learning is where we're actually learning something new as a result of the assessment. So the assessment is not just a measure of learning. The assessment is actually a place where we're learning. It's a situation or a time where we're learning something. And so that's really a key here. Let's kind of dive into this. So let me give you an example, a really practical one. And I'm going to be vulnerable here for a moment. So let's imagine that I wake up in the morning and I am leading a webinar, or maybe I have a Skype or a video conferencing session with someone, and I get up and I'm in a hurry and I get dressed, I'm late, I run out the door, I get in my car, and I ignore this mirror that was right outside of the bathroom, or right outside of the bedroom. So I don't really check to see what I look like or anything else. And then I get to my office and I turn on my webcam and answer the call coming in. And I say hello to my friend, and I look like this. So there was a problem, right? Because all I needed to do, that's right, yeah, some might actually like this better, but all I needed to do was look in the mirror before I walked out of my house, and I might have been able to avoid this rather awkward and embarrassing moment in my first interaction with this person on the webcam. Instead, I maybe look at this webcam though, and I turn it off quickly, and I pat down my hair and adjust a little bit, and this looks at least a little bit better. Maybe I could add a smile. Maybe it's a little flat there. I don't know. You could. We'll leave the hairstylist to critique. But most of the people that I interact with in my meetings would probably consider this to be a little bit more of an appropriate hairstyle for my workday than the other one. And so it's a matter of how did I know how I was doing? That's fine. Yeah, the other style, that's okay too. But the question is, the point is that I didn't know what my hair looked like before, right? I didn't have a mirror or anything that gave me feedback on how I was doing. And as a result, I had that awkward, embarrassing moment. But the idea behind assessment for learning and assessment as learning is we want to have learning environments that have lots of mirrors, metaphorically speaking. We want to make sure that there are lots of mirrors around. And the other thing is we want to make sure that the mirrors are around and that the learner learns how to use the mirror. And the learner could actually look in the mirror and say, how am I doing with regard to my learning? And then they can adjust. They can push down the hair if it's out of the way. They can fix things a little bit. I'm going to stop. We have a post here. Let me see if I can read this. It says, in the IPA, we assess interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational modes of language performance. It's quite lengthy, but because it's not just a test, rather an assessment through which students learn, the time factor is not a big deal. Interesting. Okay. Let me just dive into this from a different angle. So assessment for learning and assessment as learning, both of them are about providing lots of mirrors or helping learners actually create mirrors for themselves and use them to adjust their learning. There's a study that was done in 2010 that's really interesting, that's intriguing. It's called the Mediator Effectiveness Hypothesis. And these two researchers looked at what happened whenever people took tests, particularly practice tests or quizzes, to prepare for the actual test. And they compared two populations, a population that studied a certain amount, and then another population that studied with practice tests. And the practice tests had a significant difference in performance called test, restudy, practice. So they have a test, they restudy, and they get to restudy. And after they figure out how they did on the practice test, they learn about their mistakes, and then they go back and they study with more direction, with more clarity. So they're not just studying broadly for the topic, they're looking specifically to refine and improve on what they did before. And so now they're asking the question, well, what didn't I learn the first time? And how can I learn it? And what they found in this particular study, and this is why they call it the Mediator Effectiveness Hypothesis, is that they found that the learners who took practice tests created these mediators, or we might think of them as things like mnemonic devices, study aids, memory devices, different kinds of devices and strategies to recall at a later time the key concepts and ideas for the later test. So they found that the practice test helped learners and prompted learners to engage in this sort of thinking about their learning, learning about their learning. They figured out how they did, what they did well, what they did poorly. They went back, they honed in on studying those areas that needed improvement. They came up with specific strategies to learn it better than they did before, and then they came back and they performed better. So 54% compared to 34%. The 54% represents those who studied with practice quizzes. The 34% represented those who studied without the practice quizzes or the feedback. The key here is that the first group had some really great feedback, and they learned how to use it to improve their knowledge. That's what we're talking about with assessment as learning. So one definition that I offer here, I have the link to it. This is a source that's, it's a chapter out of a book that's provided in the Assessment as Learning badge. Assessment as Learning focuses on students, and it emphasizes assessment as a process of metacognition, so thinking about thinking, knowledge of one's own thought processes for students. So assessment for learning and assessment as learning have a lot of similarities, and they can be confusing, and it's one of those distinctions that maybe we toss out at the end of the day, but it helps us for a moment just to think about this new emphasis, which is creating a lesson or a learning environment where there's ample opportunity for students to do some thinking about their own learning, for students to do some self-evaluating, to do some of their own goal setting, to ask some questions of themselves so that they can eventually reach that goal of learning on their own without the need of a teacher in some situations, of being the person who just doesn't go to get a fish from a distribution center, but one who can fish for themselves and even prepare it for themselves. This is one simple approach, or one simple sort of four-step process. So the learner has a learning experience, and then the learner generates some feedback loops. The learner identifies ways to get feedback. Sometimes the teacher assists by creating opportunities for feedback on their progress, formative feedback. But then this is where that's where assessment for learning sort of stops in some ways. The assessment as learning picks up with the next two, where the learner monitors this feedback. So the learner begins to take responsibility and takes initiative to look at that feedback and to ask questions about what it tells them about themselves, about their learning, their lack of learning. They monitor this feedback, and then after monitoring it, they say sort of, what does this mean? And then they get to adjusting their thoughts or their actions accordingly. So they get feedback on a practice quiz, they find out that they don't understand this concept as well as they thought they did, and now they have to adjust their thinking so that their thinking more accurately represents the true meaning of a concept or that they're studying, for example. It's a pretty simple process, and we all think about this, but this is a module and this is a presentation to encourage us to maybe revisit it a little bit more. These are the kinds of questions that one might ask when they're engaging in assessment as learning. So one part of assessment as learning is at the beginning, and they might even ask a question about, well, why am I learning this? I want to pose that question for you. Why do you think this might be an important question for a learner to ask? Why am I learning this? So relevance, that's actually part of the four-part of the ARCS model of motivation. Some of you have heard attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. When those four are present, people tend to be more motivated. So one part of this, why am I learning this, is a sense of relevance. If a learner believes that what they're learning has relevance and significance, they're more likely to attend to it, so it can help them stay motivated. In fact, as a quick aside, there was a qualitative research course that I took years ago as part of my doctoral studies, and the instructor told the story of a previous student who did his entire doctoral dissertation asking the question, why do students fall asleep in class? And it was a grounded study, a grounded research study, grounded theory. So the way grounded theory works is you engage in a series of interviews of a given population that have something in common, in this case, students who fall asleep in class. You interview them and you look for some kind of recurring theme, some kind of emergent theme from the population that you're interviewing. And then, once you start to notice a pattern, you interview additional people. So you develop an initial theory, and then you test that with further interviews. And once you get to a point of redundancy, where the interviews no longer seem to be producing new insights, that's when you can develop at least a small measure of confidence that you have a theory that's worth exploring further. And that's how grounded theory works. So he asked the question, why do students fall asleep in class? Does anyone have a guess as to what he discovered? This is the neatest the neatest finding, because his finding was literally 2 words. He did expound upon it, but it was a 2-word answer to why students fall asleep in class. Anyone want to guess? They're tired, okay? That's the common assumption. They're bored. So some might say, well, it depends on what kind of school they were going to. Maybe they just partied a little bit too much the night before, and they couldn't stay awake, so they were tired for a very specific reason. You get people who have all sorts of speculations about that. And that's right, they have a headache. What he found, though, relates to board and it relates to others, but it's really profound when you think about it. The finding was perceived meaninglessness. So what he found in his study was that there were people who would stay awake even if they were quite tired and they were out late the night before. They could stay awake and they could endure even being ill, even being bored in a sense, as long as they believed what they were learning had great meaning or significance or relevance for them. So for example, it could be a very boring lecture, but it's in medical school, and they've dreamt of being a medical doctor for years and years, and they're not going to let this one boring presentation get in the way of their goal of being a medical doctor. And so they know that if they fall asleep, they won't do well on the test. And so they persevere, and they force themselves to stay open. They have an extra cup of coffee or can of caffeinated beverage of some sort, or whatever it takes, but they do something to stay awake and alert enough to try to get something out of the class. So perceived meaninglessness, on the other hand, is when someone, for one reason or another, develops the opinion that this content is not of meaning, does not have great meaning to me, it doesn't have great relevance, it doesn't have great value or significance. Well, this why am I learning this question and assessment as learning is about getting at that. It's about getting at this idea that the learner is not waiting for the teacher to motivate him or her. The learner is not waiting for the great motivating introduction and the teacher always answering the why questions. Now, a good teacher will probably do that as well, but the learner is asking this of herself or of himself as well. They're seeking it out, and they're seeking out, what's my hook? What's going to motivate me to pursue this? And they look for something until they find a good motivator. So this is a learner that's trying to figure out how to motivate themselves, how to keep themselves going. I don't know if any of you have ever visited the website Life Hacker. Life Hacker, you can Google it and check it out. But it's a fascinating group of people who engage in tons of different experiments about their lives to kind of track how they're doing, to monitor their progress. There are people who have health concerns and they track on these amazing charts to try to document, well, when do I get headaches, and to try to come up with some solutions for it. They're learners who take great responsibility. And it's a wonderful website, and it really embodies the spirit of assessment as learning. These are people who build their own assessments of themselves, and they learn from it. But they also get at this, why am I learning this? They have a motive that really drives them. The second question here is, what is my prior knowledge about it? This is a good practice of a life hacker. Yep, that's it, Aaron and Michelle. What is my prior knowledge about it? So this is what a good teacher does, right? Good teachers use illustrations and examples that are familiar to the learners. But a good learner, as they develop this assessment as learning skill, also asks questions like, well, what do I know about this? What kind of background knowledge do I have? What do I have to overcome? Do I bring in some baggage, some maybe fears about a topic? For example, for those of you that may be involved in math instruction, that's very common. And I believe that someone posted that in the Google Plus community, and they made a reference to some research by Carolyn Dweck. I don't think they actually cited Carolyn Dweck in the statement, but they were using the distinction between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. And that's a wonderful book. It's called Mindset, M-I-N-D-S-E-T, by Carolyn Dweck. And she found that one of the key indicators for student success in school is their mindset. Some people come into a subject like math and they say, I'm not good at math. And to say that I'm not good at math is gonna lead that student to be less motivated because they probably feel as if no matter what I did in this class, I can't achieve as much as the other person, or I can't achieve that much. So they're going to be stuck by this fixed mindset. On the other hand, a growth mindset is one who realizes, not ignoring the fact that there are genetic differences between people, but recognizes that with effort and time and energy, I can be better later than I am now. So they can compare to themselves and they can strive to achieve more than where they are right now, right? So the fixed mindset, right. So what is my prior knowledge about this? Helps people kind of get into that mindset. Well, what do I know? What do I have to overcome? And then they begin to ask, well, how can I grow in my knowledge or skill? This isn't, am I good or bad at it? But how can I grow in my knowledge or skill? Wherever I am right now, how can I get a little bit further? How can I grow? Now, I would argue that a culture of earning versus a culture of learning is part of what cultivates a fixed mindset in many people, though. And I think sometimes students are always just striving for the grade, and it just seems to have less relevance or significance or meaning. And they can think of themselves as, you'll hear people say, I'm an A student, or that person's a C student, or a B student, as if that's sort of this brand on them, and they're not capable of a performance that exceeds that letter grade, or one that goes below a given letter grade. And so these are the kinds of questions that can sort of help them out of this, right? And also they ask simple questions like, how am I doing? They ask that of themselves. They ask that of other people. They seek out help. By the way, a growth mindset tends to be more open to wanting to know how they do. I love this illustration in Carolyn Dweck's book about people with a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. In the book, she describes a situation where there are these people who take this test, and they're given their tests, and there are piles of their tests on the table, and they know, they're given their tests, but then there are piles of tests of other learners as well that they're able to look at and they can kind of learn from. And they found that the students with a fixed mindset usually don't want to look at the other tests that would be better than their own, because that might make them feel worse, right? On the other hand, students who have a growth mindset were very interested in learning from the sample tests of other learners. So assessment as learning is really about cultivating that growth mindset. How am I doing? What do I understand well? So there can be some time for affirmation. And what am I misunderstanding? And that's not a judgment of me as a person if we have a growth mindset. It's simply saying, oh, I might have misunderstood this concept. How can I correct that? How can I adjust? What mistakes am I making? Especially if we're talking about learning a skill versus learning knowledge. I might be doing something with not as much skill as I want to, or I'm making some mistakes in terms of my style or the way I'm going about it, right? And also, what do I need to do to adjust to improve my knowledge or skill? These are the kinds of questions that we want to get students asking in an assessment as learning lesson. So if you do decide to pursue this badge, the authentic learning experience that I've casted out there for you is where you'll take an existing lesson and you'll revise it to have more assessment as learning opportunities embedded in it. More encouragement for students to engage in assessment as learning. So Jennifer wrote, but humans are bad at self-assessment in general. So that's a really interesting point. So we may not be very effective at self-assessment at first, but the question is it possible for us to get better at self-assessment with some time and with some skill? So for example, part of self-assessment may be seeking the assessment of other people. So part of how am I doing may be looking for other people to give us some feedback on our work. But that's still assessment as learning, and it's still, in essence, a self-assessment approach, because learners are willing, they may realize that they have some blind spots about their own knowledge and abilities and skill and so forth. And so they take the initiative to seek out more feedback. So the idea here in an assessment as learning classroom, we know that it's happening because we know that learners are anxious for feedback. They're asking other people for it. They're seeking it out. The learner who wants to stick around after class and ask some questions and just to figure out, well, what am I doing? What am I not doing? How can I do it better? So the question is, if we're putting all of this on the learner, what's the role of the teacher? I'll give this analogy from American football for a second. So throwing on American football, one of the prides is that you learn to throw a perfect spiral. So it glides through the air. It's not wobbling its way through the air. It looks streamlined and it looks smooth. And, and so imagine two ways of teaching a person to throw a spiral. One, you have them sit on the bench aside the field. You pick up a football and you say, "Watch me." Now I'm in Wisconsin, and we have the Green Bay Packers here in Wisconsin, and so our quarterback is Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers can throw a nice spiral. So suppose I have the learners sit down, and I bring Aaron Rodgers out, and I have him throw football after football as the learners watch and they observe a perfect spiral. Well, that can only take you so far, right? Because if we really want learners to learn how to throw a perfect spiral, they can benefit from watching someone else. But eventually, they're going to need to put the ball in their own hands, and they're going to need to try it, right? But that doesn't mean that they couldn't benefit from some help from another person. And so I offer these 4 roles of a teacher when it comes to promoting assessment as learning. The first one is design. Design a classroom environment, design lessons that leave room for, that encourage and promote assessment as learning. So leave space for it, talk about it, use assessment as learning language with the learners. So by simply doing that, we're helping the learners take some more responsibility and get involved in the assessment process themselves. A second is demonstrate. So there is still a role for the teacher to show learners how to engage in assessment as learning. And this is where we can give examples and non-examples, right? Bad examples. And we can show what it looks like for someone to engage in assessment as learning. We can highlight the examples of people who are doing it. Model think-alouds. Great, Aaron and Michelle. Yes, absolutely. So this demonstration can be quite powerful for people to have a really concrete understanding of what it looks like to engage in assessment as learning. The third one is the teacher can be a mirror. So the teacher is a good, helpful source of feedback. And so the teacher can be that and can give the learner feedback. But ideally, it's great when the learner initiates it. They seek the teacher as a mirror to help them out. That's the ideal. And then the fourth one, which is really closely related to mirror in some ways, is to be a mentor. I often argue, even in higher education, at a university, it's not uncommon to have certain faculty members who are among a dozen of the leading scholars in the world on a very specific, narrow topic. So for example, my dissertation dealt very specifically with the intersection of personal ethics and professional ethics within the field of education and educational technology. And at the time of writing my dissertation and my work, I was probably among a handful of people that had explored that topic, that very narrow topic of personal versus professional ethics in the field of educational technology. In fact, I was the only person in the world that had actually studied that very narrow topic and published anything on it. And that's not uncommon for people that pursue a doctoral dissertation. In fact, that's what they're encouraged to do, to contribute something novel or unique. As a result, faculty can believe that what they most have to offer to their learners is their knowledge, that they know something that the students don't know. The reality is, though, in this day and age, learners can learn most knowledge through a book, a blog, a video, a website, a journal, through some kind of source. There is a great body of knowledge readily available. Sometimes it's not packaged as nicely as a particular instructor might package it for the students or so forth, but the knowledge is out there. But what's not necessarily attached to the knowledge is the mentoring. And this is where I believe that teachers have much to offer students. They have the ability to mentor and offer disciplinary thinking. So, for example, on the university level, in my context, a biology professor wants the learners to be little biologists, wants to teach them to think scientifically about the natural world. And so they are modeling and they're guiding the students as they learn to think scientifically. A history teacher. One of the roles of a history teacher is not simply to teach historical facts and dates, but to teach students to think historically about the world and about problems in the world. I'm actually an undergraduate history major, and so I still use history to tackle problems and issues. I think historically. They cultivated that kind of historical thinking. That's mentoring. That's not distributing knowledge. That's guiding people in their ability to think in a particular way or in a particular category with a certain body of knowledge. It's giving them some feedback. And that's what I believe that teachers have much to offer. They can provide some sort of expert insight. At the same time, they can realize that they have something to learn along the way, and so they can do some modeling of being doing some self-assessment and assessment excellence. So these four, I would argue, are four really key roles of a teacher in assessment as learning, but you might think of some others. This isn't an exhaustive list, but there are four of what I would argue is four of the big ideas. The last part then, and this is my last slide, so we have about 15 minutes so we can have a little more conversation, and if there's a Q&A, we can do that as well. But these are some strategies. Now, the last bullet list says, check out the Assessment as Learning Strategies article. That article is available on the beyondlettergrades.com website. The Assessment as Learning badge, I have a link to this PDF document that's a great article that gives a number of very specific strategies that a teacher could promote in a class to encourage assessment as learning. One of them that's in another article that's included in the module is the math portfolio letter, and that's a very specific example of a math teacher that has students write a letter to the teacher at the beginning of the class reflecting on a number of questions. And it becomes sort of a pre-assessment, and it allows the learners to think about themselves, but it also allows the teacher to learn a lot about the learners. What are your beliefs about math? Are you good at math? Or do you see yourself good at math or not? What strategies have helped you in the past? How do you think you learn best? And they ask a number of questions, and those prompts guide the students to engage in some sort of self-assessment. But then again, it starts the whole class in an assessment as learning sort of mindset. Another that can work in many content areas, it's not quite as natural in every content area or every grade level, but a learning journal. Lower grades can make use of learning journals as well, even prior to the learners having the ability to write or to type. By doing audio and video recordings, I've seen some really interesting ones, and sometimes the teachers do it by an interview, and they start by interviewing the students. And then they have the students listen to their own audio and video recordings, and they reflect about what they learned and what they learn about themselves. And so, yes, people make the argument, well, they're in concrete operations in terms of a developmental stage. They can't engage in too many abstractions and so forth. But there are plenty of examples of where learners can already start to do this in really impressive and significant ways. And so we can start this at a very young age where they're thinking about assessment as learning. In fact, learners do this naturally to some extent as they learn to ride bicycles and they learn to engage, they learn to have conversations with people, they learn to speak a language. They do this in some different ways. But a learning journal can make it more explicit. So we can encourage people to journal about what's working well, what are they learning, what are they not learning, what strategies are they discovering. Sometimes this can be private. You can make it with other people. So you could have a group of 4 to 5 learners that are writing a learning journal and reading each other's, and they sort of learn from each other's ideas. They can share it only with the teacher. Many different ways that it can be approached, and it depends on the context and the specific situation which one is best. But a learning journal can be helpful. Learning surveys and inventories, some of them aren't that valid, some of them aren't that reliable, but they're fun, and they're fun for some at least, and they can help bring some insights. So I gave a link to one, but if you actually just Googled inventories and e-tail, E-T-A-L-E, that's my blog. I do have a blog that has a list of 15 different fun surveys and inventories. Some of them would actually be helpful to use with learners. Others are just kind of fun things. Everything like, what's your educational philosophy, to what study skills do you have, to what are your strengths. There's even one that's, what kind of a gamer are you? Like when you play games. And there was a research study, Bartle's game study, where he found that there are 4 main categories of gamers: killers, achievers, socializers, killers, achievers, explorers, and socializers. And it's an inventory where you can figure out which one you are. I am definitely an explorer. And so actually, let me just, find the link. Give me just a second. I'll pause for a moment. I'll give you a link to those inventories. There we go. I said 15, but there are actually 10 there. By the way, I actually designed this entire massive open online course using the Bartle's 4 gamer categories. A killer is someone who is competitive against other people, and I actually didn't use that one very much. So killers probably maybe a little less motivated, although one might. They can display their badges, and so they can see that they have more badges than the other people. So the killer is really competitor, so they can maybe sort of out-badge other people. The achiever is the person that does often feel rewarded by letter grades, and in this class we have badges for the achievers to earn. The explorer is rewarded by being the person who discovers something before others, and they're often rewarded by kind of displaying the fact that they've learned. That's why we encourage people to share Twitter feeds and to post on their blogs and to contribute additional resources in the Google community. That can help the explorer feel motivated, and the socializers are motivated by activities like what's happening in this general discussion, by connecting with people on Twitter and the Google community. So I actually built this course with those 4 in mind. I apologize for that huge aside, but learning surveys and inventories can be fun. And actually, Jennifer, I am scheduled to present on on the result of my last massive open online course and this one at Disney World in Florida. There's a online learning conference in about a month, and that'll be the first time that so sometime between the end of this course and that time, I'll be reflecting on some of the successes, the challenges, and so forth. The learning inventories can be helpful because they help learners learn about themselves. And even if they're not entirely valid or reliable, they still encourage people to think about their own strategies themselves. Practice quizzes with reflection can be quite powerful. If there's no reflection in practice quizzes, they could just, for a fixed mindset, they take a quiz, they don't do well, they say, I'm not smart, or I'm not good at this subject. So it has to be with reflection, with a growth mindset as well. Build opportunities for workshopping and peer assessment so learners can get feedback from one another. A 60-second think is an example that's in one of the articles that you'll have in this batch, where people have 60 seconds to simply reflect with a peer or even go around the room and share what are they learning, what are they struggling with, what's going well. It's just a 60-second snapshot for them to reflect on what's going well or not going well in the learning experience. A checklist of self-assessment questions. So the questions that I provided on a previous slide, you could provide a list of those or a select list of those as a guide for students to use as sort of a study aid or a teaching or a thinking aid as they begin to internalize those questions eventually. And then the last bullet is just a list of tons of different strategies. And that's really it. That's the end of this assessment as learning presentation. I finished with some strategies. If you're interested in this and you'd like to explore it further, let's continue the conversation in our Google community on Twitter, and maybe you would like to explore some of these topics and do some of the readings for yourself and dig in a little deeper. Well, that's your chance to go for the badge and to explore it further. So now we have a little less than 10 minutes available. I'll just open it up for some conversation and questions, and I'll be quiet for a moment. I've been trained as a teacher, so I can wait 60 seconds or longer to see if we have any comments or questions. So Aaron and Michelle bring up this idea of the learning styles. I'm going to be quiet as people type a few more comments, but I'd love to to comment on that as well in a moment. So approaches to learning, are you talking about in reference to learning styles? Right, yeah. This one is sort of whetting the appetite. So each of the live sessions is kind of challenges people to kind of dive in further. So when you taught the IB, let me see here, the IB middle school, one of the components was to become aware of how we learn best. So yeah, absolutely. This is part of that assessment as learning. Although assessment as learning goes beyond just learning about how we learn, and then it's using that knowledge to actually learn amid assessments, right? And so that would be a slight distinction. The learning styles research is an interesting one because we do know that learning styles and can impact motivation and attention. But there have been a lot of studies that seem to indicate that designing lessons to meet different learning styles does not necessarily increase student learning, which is interesting. We find that different strategies can be more effective. And yet that doesn't mean necessarily that learning style literature is unimportant. It can still be helpful as learners kind of just get to know themselves and sort of how they learn best. Just because I learn best one way doesn't mean that's the only way I can learn something. But it becomes helpful to maybe think about those things, to know those things. So let me just kind of scan through here. I got a little bit behind on some of the comments. What do you have about using metacognition in the classroom? One of the articles in the badge has a wonderful section on metacognition, and it breaks it into two broad categories of metacognition. It breaks down the kinds of questions that learners can learn to ask in order to develop each of those types of metacognition. So that's a great resource to check out if you'd like to explore it. It might be of interest to some of your colleagues as you're looking at this. There's so much research that shows that learning styles don't make any difference, right? So Beth, I would just make that distinction that they show that the studies are specific to what students have or haven't learned. There is some evidence to suggest that they may impact motivation and attention and so forth, which can have an indirect, obvious impact on what people do or don't learn in some cases. Also, there haven't been as many studies about the relationship between learning styles and satisfaction. Maybe teachers say, well, my goal isn't satisfaction, but there might be a stronger correlation between awareness of learning styles and satisfaction. But as I noted before, for example, if people are looking for a lot of impact in terms of research, we find that, for example, the body of knowledge called cognitive load theory, about how to manage load and design things that the students manage their load well, that can actually have some more significant results than some of the learning style design part, which is kind of interesting. Let's see. It's been interesting for me to see metacognition as part of the assessment in kindergarten math in the NYS math modules. Interesting. Is this aligned to the new Common Core, Aaron and Michelle? Yeah, and thanks for the distinction, Beth, between learning styles and learning preferences. I think it's important to offer the same content in different technologies, not some in audio, some to read, some to listen. So that, Sabine, is what we often talk about as multimodal communication. And we do find that actually relates to cognitive load theory as well. So, and this is actually the neat thing. So teachers learn about learning theories and so forth, but why not let the learners learn about this? Why not let them engage in some of these studies so that they can leverage these? So for example, in cognitive load theory, we know that if I put 3 visuals in front of you, and this is interesting. So when we started putting interactive whiteboards, when we started putting them in front of math classrooms, some people found student performance on quizzes and tests declining. But when you observed, doing some qualitative research, when I walked into a classroom, it was not hard for me to see why learning declined. I walked into the classroom, I saw a whiteboard up on the wall, I saw an interactive whiteboard next to it. I saw the teacher writing on the whiteboard using the interactive whiteboard. I looked at the students' desks, and the students had their book open, and they had a textbook open, and they had a notebook next to them, and the teacher would often say, "Look at me." So the students were jumping between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different visuals. And that is cognitive overload. Your brain just can't handle that many areas to attend to at the same time. Easiest way to improve that lesson, drop it down to 1 visual, or 2 visuals at the most. But they can hear and see at the same time. That's multimodal, right? And we can also give them multi-sensory experiences and so forth. So that can have some positive impacts. But why not help students become aware of that themselves, even in terms of their own study skills and strategies, if they're trying to attend to multiple things? The myth of multitasking, for example. The student really believes that studying during commercials between television shows is going to be the most effective approach. There's evidence that being exposed to material through various methods is effective. I'll stop here because Sabine said what I was going to say. Yep, absolutely, right. Different methods, variety of methods can be quite popular because we know that repetition is key to learning, but boredom is not. And so even the variety of different types of presentation and different types of content can keep one stimulated and interested and engaging in that repetition. That's one of the reasons that people suspect that we have that finding. The teachers write down what students say as they work through the math problems. It's an interesting lens into student learning. Oh, that is interesting. That actually is interesting too because it ties into a body of research called narrative assessment. We have a module on narrative feedback, which is a totally different thing. The narrative assessment is where we actually study the narratives and the language, the discourse of the learners, and we help the learners to study it, and we try to learn something about the learners. Very interesting. Well, we are at the end of our hour. It's at 6 o'clock now. Central Time. It's tons of different time zones. But I'm going to stop there. I'll stick around if people have other questions or comments, and we can chat a little bit further. But this has been great. We've been a small but active group. Wonderful.